The public basically has been totally lied to. Right now, there are 131 active deep underground military bases in the United States, well hidden from the American public.
Deep beneath the surface of our everyday world, terrifying secrets are being held. I'm Josh Ninocchio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. On a July afternoon in 1987, a 21-year-old woman named Christa Tilton was going about her day when she suddenly felt dizzy and lightheaded. She sat down, figuring she just needed a moment to collect herself, but the next thing she knew, she was waking up and it was dark outside. She looked at a clock and was horrified to see that 3 full hours had passed, and she had no memory of what happened in that time. Initially, Christa tried to rationalize the experience. She told herself she must have been exhausted and, simply just fainted, sleeping through the afternoon. But in the days that followed, she began having these horrific nightmares. In them, she would see strange, distorted figures and feel this overwhelming sense of dread come over her, but when she'd wake up, the specific details of the dreams would simply vanish, leaving only terror behind. She became convinced that these nightmares were not just bad dreams, but they were echoes of whatever had happened during her 3 hours of lost time. Now, this conviction sent her on a desperate search for answers, and that's when she began researching cases of missing time and memory loss. And the more she read, the more she found stories that sounded disturbingly similar to her own. These are stories that often ended with one terrifying explanation: alien abduction. Unsure of what else to do, and on the advice of a local ufologist that she had contacted, she decided to undergo regressive hypnosis, hoping to unlock the memories that were tormenting her from just beyond her consciousness. And as she lay in a reclined chair in a quiet room, the hypnotist's voice guided her back to that July afternoon. And as she went deeper and deeper into a trance, the wall in her mind that had been blocking her memory suddenly crumbled, and a flood of incredibly vivid and detailed images washed over her. And the first thing she remembered was that she hadn't just fainted. Right before she lost consciousness, 2 small humanoid creatures had approached her, grabbed her by the arms, and everything had gone dark. Her next memory was of being on a cold metal table inside what she knew was a ship. Another humanoid, taller than the others, approached her, and she would later come to call this being her guide. He handed her a glass filled with this strange liquid and told her to drink. Now, as soon as she did, an incredible energy surged through her body. She felt alert, cheerful, and unafraid. And after she finished the drink, the guide led her off the ship, not back to where she had been taken, but to a dark, kind of deserted landscape under a night sky. In the distance, she could see a faint light emanating from a small hill, coming from what looked like the entrance to a cave. And so as they walked toward it, she saw a man standing near the entrance. And she could tell that he was human, or at least looked like a human, and was dressed in a red military-style jumpsuit, holding an automatic weapon. This is getting weird, right? The guide greeted the man as if they were colleagues, and Christa noticed a strange patch on the man's uniform. And so, as they entered the cave, it opened up into a tunnel that kind of sloped deep into the earth. It was clear they were going directly under the mountain. Inside, they were met by another guard in a red jumpsuit. And then, Christa saw something that really rattled her mind because it made no sense. A modern computerized checkpoint with cameras on either side. To her left, a small transit vehicle was parked in a large grove cut into the rock, and to her right was a long, sterile corridor that stretched into the distance, lined with office doors. It was evident they were in some kind of massive underground facility. So Christa and her guide boarded the transit car, which then sped them through the complex, and she starts asking her guide where are they going, but he only replied that he had to show her some things that she needed to know for future use. They had just entered the first level of the institution, and when she asked what kind of institution it was, he didn't answer. Now, eventually the car stopped and they got out, on what the guide called level 2. And it was here that she saw what looked like a normal office building, with ordinary people and business attire, just kind of walking back and forth, ignoring her. But then they walked past a huge factory-like room, and inside she saw a small saucer-shaped craft being worked on by several of the classic gray aliens with large heads and, the black almond-shaped eyes. Just like the humans in the offices, the Greys paid no attention to her, acting as if she had every right to be there. The guide then led her to another elevator, and they descended to level 5. Now, the moment the doors opened, she was immediately hit with this sickening, sweet smell that she recognized from her time as a young nurse's aide: formaldehyde. The air was so thick with it, it was just pungent. And the guide assured her everything was fine, but she was starting to get really fearful. And in fact, the fear was becoming so overwhelming, it was now overriding the effects of the drink that she had earlier. But they continued. They walked down a corridor and stopped in front of a large room. And peeking inside, she saw rows of huge 4-foot-tall metal tanks, all connected by tubes and wires to a complex computer system. A humming sound filled the air, and she could see something was moving inside the vats, causing the liquid to ripple. And she started to walk closer to see what was in them, but the guide grabbed her arm forcefully, telling her she didn't need to see the contents, that it would only complicate matters. He then dragged her down the hall into a large laboratory filled with medical equipment that she had never seen, and a small gray alien stood at a counter, its back to her, preparing what looked like surgical instruments. You heard the clinking sound of metal on metal, and it just made her even more fearful. Now, the guide told her to sit on an examination table in the middle of the room, and as she did, a human doctor in a lab coat entered, greeted the guide, and then looked over at her. And the guide smiled and told her he would wait outside, that this would only take a few moments. And this is when Christa began to cry. The gray alien glanced at her, then turned back to its work, unamused, and the doctor called for assistance. And another gray entered the room, and the next thing she remembered, she was lying on the table, feeling very sleepy. And as the doctor and the two grays examined her, she felt this sudden stabbing pain in her abdomen, and she screamed. Now, the human doctor quickly rubbed a cold substance on her stomach, and the pain immediately subsided. She begged them to let her go, but they just continued to work on her methodically. Well, when they were finished, she was told to get dressed in a small adjoining room, and she noticed there was blood between her legs, but she was too numb with shock to process it. So she changed back into her clothes and walked out to find her guide talking quietly with the doctor, and as you can imagine, she felt completely helpless, like a guinea pig in an experiment. And as they left the lab, the guide told her the procedure had been necessary and that she would forget everything. So as they walked back to the transit car, she asked him again what this place was, like, where am I? What's going on? He simply said it was a very important facility and that she would be returning here over the next few years. Now, before they left, the guide took her to one last area, and there is where she saw the most terrifying sight of all. Lined up against a wall were several large, transparent-like tubes, and inside each tube was a person standing motionless, their eyes wide open. Now, she couldn't tell if they were alive or dead. They just stood there like wax figures in the state of suspended animation. But in other chambers, she saw animals in cages, like the humans, but also frozen in time. And she pressed her hand against the glass, just trying to get a reaction, but there was nothing. Her guide took her back to the transit car, back up to the surface, and back onto the ship. And the next thing she knew, she was waking up in her home 3 hours later with no memory of what had just happened. Well, it would turn out that according to Christa, this was just her first trip to the secret underground base. Over the years, she claimed that she was abducted many more times. She came to believe the facility was the infamous Dulce base in New Mexico, a supposed joint human-alien underground complex at the center of countless dark secrets. She claimed she was used to birth hybrid children and that she herself was part alien. It gets darker because this wasn't the only base that she was taken to. In fact, Christa said this. I am aware of many, many, many underground structures or bases that are used for different purposes. Most of the underground bases are used for secret or other purposes involving the government, which conduct certain types of tests underground. And then there are bases. One in particular, north of Tucson, Arizona, where I am almost sure that I was taken. It passes under the code or real name Evergreen Aviation. They have all the flying objects there, and in 10 years of research, I have found that this institution is founded or supported by the CIA. But even more chilling is that Christa is just one of many who've undergone this kind of therapy and relived absolute terror. In the depths of secret government labs, rumors swirl about formulas that push human limits. Lucky for us, the only classified recipe you need has already leaked, straight from Trade Coffee. I'm a year-round cold brew fiend, and Trade is now my go-to. In fact, they're the #1 coffee destination in the US for hot and cold drinkers, partnering with 15 top roasters to create a special cold brew collection. Beans arrive freshly roasted, ground exactly for cold brew, plus the simple gear that makes brewing as easy as pouring water in a pitcher overnight. The result? Smooth, cafe-quality cold brew that costs way less than a $6 coffee shop run and smells like you just walked into a roastery and not a government lab. For a limited time, Trade is getting 50% off a month of cold brew. That's around 60 cups of cold brew for 50% off when you go to drinktrade.com/lurks. That's drinktrade.com/lurks to get 50% off 1 month of cold brew. drinktrade.com/lurks. Eyewitness sketch artist Sibylla Irwin had a very identical experience to Christa.
From a little kid on, I was having what I thought they were just vivid dreams, with aliens in them. When you're a child, you just think everyone is, everyone's life is kind of like your life, internally, externally. If you've got parents that drink, you think everyone's got parents that drink, and that's perfectly normal, right? And I just thought everybody had, dreams of these little people vaporizing through the wall, communicating with you, the telepathic thing. Being in a white room on a stretcher with, them doing medical exams on you. I just thought that they were really vivid dreams, and that was it until the real kicker came in 1987 when I saw the book Communion. It had just come out. And you know how in the really big bookstores in the malls, when a new book comes out, they used to have a big display, like right out front, 50 books would be there. And I just happened to be walking by, and I turned and I saw that face, and I knew her. Like, I knew her instantly. It was instant recognition, and I also instantly had to find the nearest bathroom, and I ran in the stall, just started throwing up, like, violently. And I was not sick before that point. Like, the seeing that face was so disturbing to me, and that I knew who she was. A lot of people, I discovered later, I've heard throughout the years, a lot of people had a very similar reaction. After I saw that book cover, anytime I would try to remember like how I knew her, I would just get these violent headaches, and which I had never had a problem with before. So that was odd. The only way I could get rid of them was just to go to sleep. And if I'd go to sleep, I'd wake up and it would be gone. I finally called Mutual UFO Network, and Walt Andrus was the president at the time. I said, look, this is what's happening, and what do you think? And he said, well, I think, would you be interested in going under, regressive hypnosis? And I said, I would, but I don't know anybody, and I don't want to be led. I really just want to find out what's there. And so, but it took me 6 months to get up the courage to go do the regression, because I was really kind of terrified what I was going to uncover. The whole thing started, the regressionist took me back to the very first time I had an encounter with these beings. I was standing in my bedroom, in my crib, holding onto the rails, and this little man just materialized through the wall. Big-headed. I even drew a picture of him after I came out with the regression. Large cranium, small eyes, not the big black almond-shaped upturned eyes. This was just a very small, frail man with a large cranium, and he was just a friend. He was just a friend. After I did the hypnosis, I asked my mom. I said, Mom, did I ever have an invisible friend? And she goes, oh yeah. you and your older brother both had an invisible friend. Because sometimes you guys are so adamant I have to set a place at the table for him. Now, after I did the regression, the headache stopped. And we just kind of scraped the surface of the times that I'd been taken. So I can't talk. The only person in my family I can talk to about that is my sister, because she shared the same bedroom with me. So she had some memories of, the way these things would pop in the room. But now I have 3 children. One of my biggest fears as a parent was that they were going to also disturb my kids, and they did. I think this was 95 or 96. My son came walking into the kitchen. I think I was making breakfast, and he came walking into the kitchen and a very strange look on his face. And I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Come to my room." So I walked down the hall with him and got in his room, and he closed the door. He sat down on his bed and he pulled his boxers down, and he had a triangular shaped puncture mark in his groin. I don't know if you've ever seen what a smallpox shot looks like. When we were kids, we got these in our arm. I guess it was the device was round and it had needles, like needles that were in a circle, and it was punctures. So my son had a perfect triangle with three puncture marks on his groin, and he said, "Mom, what is that?" And I of course I immediately thought, "Oh, crap." Now they're taking samples and doing stuff with my kids, still. My daughter walked in. She's 2 years older than he is. And she goes, Nathan showed her, and she left the room and went to her room. And about 10 seconds later, we heard her scream. And she had the same puncture mark on her groin, just in a different place.
Christa Tilton wasn't the only one to bear witness to Dulce Base either. A special U.S. government geologist and engineer named Phil Schneider, who was involved in the construction of deep underground military bases, or DUMBs, said this.
1947 is what the public has been told. Something crashed in the backyard in New Mexico, a place called Roswell, New Mexico. The military's known about the alien question for the better part of 70 years. And they first saw their glimpse of what was going on as early as 1909 in the American Southwest. All information dealing with alien or alien reproduced technology well hidden from the American public. Right now, there are 131 active deep underground military bases in the United States. There's 1,477 of them worldwide. The magneto-leviton trains that connect all the deep underground military bases. The public basically has been totally lied to. We're considered stupid or even moronic in some cases.
To make matters stranger, even local news had picked up on some of the strange events happening in and around the area.
They threw down a ladder from that spaceship, and then 2 small people started climbing down. It was huge. I just saw the bottom of it. It was like flat like this. Down this way, the waist down, it's a goat. It has a tail. But up here, it's a man.
Many of her neighbors claim similar strange sightings.
Some people in town say the base is run by aliens working with our federal government to conduct mind control and genetic experiments.
Unfortunately, where she was taken to, why she was chosen, or any of the real specifics, well, that remains a mystery. On the night of November 17th, 1977, a 50-year-old miner named Mario Cueto sat on the cold sand of Yanurina Beach in Peru, clutching his stomach. The pain from his chronic ulcers was particularly bad tonight, but he wasn't about to let it ruin his fishing trip. He, along with his son and 3 of his closest friends, fellow miners named Francisco, Ricardo, and Benjamin, had been planning this trip for weeks. They were all hard workers, and a night out fishing under the stars was their way of unwinding. They had driven hours to get to this remote stretch of coastline in Arequipa, a place so isolated it felt like they were the only people on Earth. The sky was clear, and the only sounds were the rhythmic crashes of waves and the quiet chatter of the friends as they cast their lines into the water. Around 1:30 or so in the morning, as Mario was trying to ignore another sharp pain in his gut, Ricardo suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence, and he pointed up at the sky. The other men, of course, followed his gaze, and there, hanging silently above the ocean, were 3 metallic saucer-shaped objects. They weren't moving, but they were rotating slowly, ringed with brilliant, colorful lights that pulsed in shades of yellow and red. The 5 fishermen stood frozen, their lines forgotten in the water, and Francisco, who was an avid photographer, instinctively reached for his camera bag before remembering, with a curse, that he'd left it at home. Of course, no one said a word. They just stared, trying to process what it was they were seeing, and Mario, ever the instigator, broke the silence. He grabbed his flashlight, aimed it up at the objects, and flicked it on and off, just trying to get its attention. Instantly, the spinning of the saucer stopped, and the objects themselves became stationary. But the lights around their edges continued to rotate, casting this strange, silent disco almost across the ocean. Then, slowly and in perfect unison, the 3 crafts began to descend. They didn't fall, they actually moved with a very controlled, deliberate purpose, entering the ocean without so much as a splash. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, leaving only the 5 stunned men on the shore. Now Ricardo finally broke the silence, whispering to his friends, "Did you guys just see that?" Now, he was trying to sound braver than ever and replied without hesitation that they were flying saucers. Now, for a while, they were all too shaken to do much of anything. They decided to pack up their gear and move to a different spot a little further down the beach, where they hoped that their luck would be better. So they set up their things, and one by one, they succumbed to their fatigue, collapsing onto the sand and falling into this deep sleep. Now, it was Benjamin who woke up first, just as the sky was beginning to lighten. But it wasn't the dawn that had woken him. It was a strange, silvery light reflecting off the wet sand, and so he sat up, rubbing his eyes, and then he scrambled over to his friends, shaking them awake, and he pointed down the beach, asking what the strange object was, wondering aloud if the army had somehow arrived on this desolate beach. About 50 or so meters away, sitting right at the edge of the water, was a large tank-like object. It was about 2 meters high and 4 meters long, made of a seamless, shimmering silver metal. It had no wheels, no visible seams, no markings of any kind. It just sat there, reflecting the pre-dawn light in a way that almost kind of made it glow. Standing chest deep in the violent surf nearby were 3 distinct figures. Now, initially, these fishermen thought that they were just men, as weird as this was, but as they looked and stared, they realized nothing about this was ordinary. The figures in the water were giants, impossibly tall, and dressed head to toe in the same shiny silver material as the craft. They wore boots, gloves, and helmets that completely obscured their faces. Ricardo would later recall that they couldn't see their faces, that everything was silver, and that they moved with this robotic gait. Now, the figures were standing in waves that crashed against their chests with enough force to knock a normal man off his feet, but they just stood there, holding their ground, motionless and unaffected. Bizarrely, they seemed to be fishing. They would raise their arms in a casting motion, and the men on the beach could hear a faint whistling sound, like a line cutting through the air, but the figures held no rods or no lines or any equipment. And then, one of the figures took a step out of the water and onto the sand. As its silver boot touched the shore, the sand around it seemed to hiss and emit a smoke as if it were boiling. The fishermen, of course, were terrified, all except for one. Mario Cueto, despite the searing pain in his stomach, was consumed by this defiant curiosity. While his friends huddled together, he stood up, and Francisco tried to warn him, grabbing his arm, telling him it was dangerous, that this thing could be from another planet. Doesn't this sound like the plot from like a 1950s or 60s sci-fi movie? Crazy, right? But in defiance, Mario shook him off. He was going to get a closer look at that craft, and he began walking slowly, deliberately down the beach toward the silver tank, and as he got closer, one of the giant figures in the water turned its head toward him. It didn't speak, but it slowly shook its head from side to side, a clear, unmistakable warning not to come any closer. And Mario hesitated for a second and then kept walking. He was only a few meters from the craft when he saw a small window on its side, and he crept up to it and peered inside, and there he saw a 4th silver-clad figure sitting at a small table. It was holding what looked like a flat, melon-colored tortilla and was eating it. Now, as Mario watched, the figure tore off a piece and casually tossed it toward a small opening near the window. The scrap fell out onto the sand, and without thinking, he bent down, picked up the strange, warm piece of food, and put it in his mouth. The effect was immediate and violent. It buckled his knees, and he fell to the sand, vomiting uncontrollably. He stumbled back to his friends, pale and shaking, unable to explain what had just happened, and then the strangest thing of all occurred. As his friends gathered around him, this wave of exhaustion washed over all 5 of them simultaneously. This wasn't natural tiredness, it was this heavy, irresistible force. Now, as Ricardo would later describe it, they simply conked out. And when they awoke hours later, the sun was high in the sky, the silver craft was gone, and the giant figures were gone. They scrambled to their feet and rushed to the shoreline, desperately searching for any sign of what had happened. But of course, there was nothing. It was as if the entire encounter had been nothing more than a shared nightmare. Fearing ridicule, they kept their story to themselves for decades. They went back to their lives, to their work in the mines, trying to forget the impossible morning on that beach. But for Mario, something changed. Because as the months went by, he noticed that chronic, agonizing pain from his stomach ulcers, a condition that had plagued him for years at this point, was fading away. And in fact, within 6 months, it was gone entirely. And when he went to his doctors, as you can imagine, they were baffled. They ran tests, but they could find no medical explanation. The ulcers that had been a constant source of misery in his life had completely healed. While you and I have tons of questions about this man's account, it's changed Mario's life forever. South America is full of strange UFO and humanoid accounts just like the one I shared with you, and there's just so many, it makes us wonder what's going on down there and what's so special about South America that make it so concentrated for things like this.
The Peruvian government has not controlled it, which is why you can go there and you can still see things. They used to have stuff here in some of the museums. It's all with NAGPRA, Native American Grave Protection Repatriation Act. You know, you can't find anything. I mean, it's just it's a controlled narrative.
What makes this 1977 case even more interesting is the similarities it has to another very famous UFO case that involves food.
In the 1960s, I think it was April 18th, 1961. Joe is sitting in his kitchen, really well regarded by the community. You know, he was Santa Claus for the community some. He was, you know, an active member in the community. And he was sitting at his kitchen table and he was finishing up, you know, breakfast or a late breakfast or an early lunch, something like that. And he hears this sound that's like the sound of wet pavement, tires moving across wet pavement. And he looks outside and he thinks that there's something settling down into his yard, and he thinks at first oh no, the roof of my house has come off. But as he's looking at it, he sees that it looks like 2 bowls set on top of each other, and it's, you know, shiny and chrome. But he rushes outside, and this sort of, the way he describes it is kind of like a car trunk opening. This portal on the UFO opens up, and he sees a couple of men inside, and they're not aliens. They do appear to be men. He said that, I think Joe Simonton himself said that they looked like dark-skinned Italians, I think is what he said. You know, consider the time, consider the place, I guess. One of them is sort of gesturing at him, and he infers, and it's kind of interesting, you look at some of Joe Simonton's interviews, and he looks a little bit haunted at this point, because he said that he looked into the entity's eyes, and this person's eyes really seemed to sort of look into his soul. But he gathered, in his simple way, that these beings must want water. And they handed him this jug that he says was the most beautiful piece of, you know, most beautiful container he'd ever seen. He'd never seen anything on Earth at all that looked as, you know, ornate and captivating. And so he, you know, opens the door and he goes down to the basement, and he has a pump down there. He pumps up some water and he brings it back. And he's sort of leaning up to hand this jug of fresh water up to one of these UFO occupants. And he notices that another one of these beings is working on this flameless griddle, is what he described it in the back, because he can see inside the craft, and there's, I think, a couple of little panels and stuff, but most of it looks like this black raw iron. And on this one flat surface, that one of the UFO occupants is flipping these sort of discs, and he can't really figure out what they are. But he makes this motion like, "Oh, you're going to eat? Can we eat? Or you're going to eat?" the UFO occupant decides that this means that Joe is hungry. So he hands these things over to Joe. I can't remember exactly how many it is because you read conflicting reports. 3 is kind of the general number. 1 ended up in the hands of J. Allen Hynek, who was doing a lot of research at the time. One was shipped away for analysis, and Joe kept 1. Joe sees that they look like these little cookies or pancakes, and there are still pictures you can find online, and there's actually one of these is still on display outside a cafeteria at a military base, if you can believe it. But it looks like this sort of like loose lattice work of grain product. And he tastes one, and he says that they taste horrible. They taste like cardboard. Joe even said, the beings were rather short. They were like 4 feet tall or so. And he said, no wonder they don't get so big if they're eating that for their meals. Joe takes a bite, and that's kind of the end of the interaction. Door on the side of the craft closes, and the UFO takes off into the sky. Joe suffered a lot for this. He came forward. It's an absolutely absurd story. Everybody knows that it's absurd, especially the crowd of modern folks who like to talk about sinister alien agendas and hybridization and things like that. They have no time for something like the Joe Simonton story, even though he had physical evidence from his encounter. There was never any deception detected on Joe's part. And these pancakes or cookies, whatever you want to call them, they're usually called pancakes. This is the UFO pancake story. Were analyzed, and the analysis revealed that they were completely made of terrestrial ingredients, primarily buckwheat, but with a noticeable lack of salt. Which is interesting because if you ever cooked, that even some rudimentary pastries and things that you make will require salt, even if you don't taste it. There's a lot of back and forth, and he's interviewed numerous times, and there's a bit of a media frenzy. He passed away eventually and is still buried up there in Eagle River. Why I find that story interesting is because it's high strangeness. It's so goofy. Another reason is because of my interest in fairy folklore. Jacques Vallée in 1969 wrote this work that's been really sort of the cornerstone for a lot of the stuff that I do, and it was called Passport to Magonia. Other people had sort of briefly or furtively drawn this comparison in the past, but Vallée really did a great job of showing the similarities between some of these older ideas surrounding spirits, and in particular, fairies, the fae folk, and the modern UFO contact experience. And one of the things that Vallée noted was that there's a lot of fairy lore surrounding buckwheat, including, fairies sort of dispensing or rationing buckwheat grain to people in certain parts of his native France. But also, fairies always had an aversion to salt. That was one of the ways to keep the fairies at bay was to put out salt. And, that's something you'll hear in other occult practices too, is that the way you keep out spirits and demons and things like that in general is to use salt. So Vallée said, oh, look, we got buckwheat, we've got a lack of salt. This sounds kind of like a fairy story because, again, Simonton mentioned that these entities had dark skin, and a lot of these fairy stories, including the modern ones, will talk about the fairies sort of having darker skin and this sort of wizened complexion. They're all sort of wrinkled and stuff. And there's an island off the coast of Germany where local folklore holds that a race of dwarves, referred to as the, pardon my pronunciation, the Unerbansk or Unerbanski, were very fond of helping out farmers. And Joe Simonton is a farmer. And these dwarves on this particular island helped out farmers who were working in the field by bringing them fresh water and pancakes. And that to me is, whenever you find a little tidbit like that, that's when my alarm bells really start going off, because I don't think Joe Simonton was reading a book of German folklore. The Joe Simonton story has always been a favorite of mine, and you might see it on Lurks Beneath soon.
As bizarre as these accounts are, there are certainly an overwhelming amount of experiencers. It, folks, remains a mystery. On a cold February night in 2004, a teenager named Ben and his 2 friends, Michael and Chris, were sitting around his garage in Anchorage, Alaska, bored out of their minds. It was late, and outside, the world was already buried under a thick, fresh blanket of snow that had fallen a few days earlier. Mike turned to the others and just said, "You guys want to go for a ride?" He was nodding toward their 3 snow machines parked in the corner. Now, technically, riding snow machines within the Anchorage city limits was illegal. But just a little ways north of Ben's house were miles of incredible trails that, snaked and winded through the woods and up near the power line clearings east of Potter Marsh. It was a place they knew well, and so a few minutes later, the three friends were roaring down the street, and they rode for about a quarter mile before Ben, who was in the lead, veered off the road and onto a trailhead, plunging them into the deep woods. Now here, the only light came from the powerful beams of their headlights, which was so dark it kind of cut this narrow beam through the pitch black forest. So for about a half an hour or so, Ben continued to lead the way, weaving through the trees with his friends close behind. The cold air whipped at his face and he felt this rush of adrenaline and freedom. And this was exactly what they had been looking for. Eventually, they reached a familiar intersection of trails and pulled up next to each other, cutting their engines, and all of them just took a minute and were like, wow, it's so quiet out here. And so they just sat there for a few minutes talking and laughing, their breath pluming in the air, really enjoying themselves. Well, they took off again. Ben was still in the lead, and he felt confident and decided to explore a less traveled game trail he'd seen before. This trail was narrow, and he had to maneuver carefully, but it soon opened up into a wide, beautiful clearing. Ben gunned the engine and rode out into the open space, his friends following about 50 yards behind him, and as he sped across the clearing, he came up on a small mound of snow. He hit it with a bit of speed, getting a little air before landing softly on the other side. But as his headlight beam settled, it illuminated something on the ground that made him slow to a stop. There, in the pristine, unbroken snow, was a set of tracks. And these were huge, much larger than any animal track he'd ever seen. And the prints were sunk deep into the 10 inches of fresh snow, which means that whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Ben's first thought was that it had to be a moose because they were very common here and they're massive. So he followed the tracks with his eyes and they led to a spot about 20 feet away where it looked like something had pushed aside a huge area of snow and lay down for a while. It was a large, matted depression, big enough for a very large animal. And the first thing that comes to his mind is this must have been a moose bedding down for the night, just trying to rationalize the strangeness of the scene. But his curiosity got the better of him. His friends were still behind, just entering the clearing, and he figured he had a minute to investigate, right? So he followed the tracks as they continued away from the depression and went over another small hill. He slowly drove his snow machine up the incline, his headlight pointing up into the dark sky, and as he crested the hill, the beam of his light dropped. There, not 10 or 12 feet in front of him, was this creature. Enormous, covered in dark, thick hair, and running away from him on two legs. Ben was simply frozen, his mind unable to process what was happening, and then he had this wave of primal fear go over him. So he slammed on the brakes, his entire snow machine skidding to a halt, and it just continued to run and jumped cleanly over a large snow-covered log and vanished. Ben didn't even think. He yanked the handlebars of his snow machine, spinning it around, and gunned the engine, racing back the way he came. So he flew over the hill back towards the first mound where they had initially seen the tracks, and he met his friends as they were just coming over it. They were very confused by his sudden, frantic retreat. He didn't slow down, he just kept screaming, "We need to get out of here now!" and just blasted past them. He didn't look back to see if they were following. He just rode as fast as he could, completely terrified out of his mind. He didn't stop until he was back on the main road. His friends, who pulled up a moment later, were laughing, and they're like, "Dude, what's your issue? What was that all about?" But Ben was so on edge and he's shaking and he tried to explain to them what he saw. But of course, his friends just mocked him. They laughed at him and, they burst out laughing. And they're like, "Dude, it was probably just a bear or, someone in a gorilla suit trying to mess with people. I think you're losing it." It wasn't a bear and it certainly wasn't a person because it was so powerful and fluid in its movement and, it had long swinging arms at its side and it kind of just plowed through the deep snow with such an ease that it was impossible. And even several times after this, his friends started to bring up the moose incident in the woods where Ben got spooked by seeing a large moose, and they never let him live it down. But Ben was 100% positive about what he saw in the beam of his headlight that night, alone in the Alaskan wilderness. He had seen a Bigfoot. One of the largest debates in the field is that Bigfoot is more than just an ape. It's a supernatural creature capable of mind speak, going through portals, and possessing power far beyond human comprehension.
You encounter these sort of two different kinds of Bigfoot. The one that is, as I said earlier, more primitive and more like a smart ape, and then the other one, which is clearly telepathic and able to communicate in very sophisticated ways. And that seems to be consistent across the board as it pertains to Bigfoot. Some people, for example, I have my friend Mancow, the famous shock jock from Chicago, had a very close encounter with a Bigfoot in Missouri when he was a boy, and it was and he's talked to me about it in great detail, and he just believes it's a big animal, it's a beast, and the way he describes it is indeed very bestial. It was just like a large, intelligent gorilla, something like that, but not anywhere near as intelligent as a human being, but more intelligent than a gorilla. And it was clearly an animal. And, he was very close to it. But then there's a story I'm tracking here in Montana where some individuals I know are having encounters with a Bigfoot, a male and a female. And this thing is not just an animal. This is an intelligent being that seems to have extraordinary capabilities. So these two things are always in play. These two, versions of Bigfoot are always in play. And some people will attest to the fact this is just a smart ape, and others will say, no, this is something more than just a smart ape.
Eyewitness Ernie Davio had his own shocking encounter, and based on his experiences, this seems like far more than just a large beast.
But this area here, I've hunted all over the East Coast, New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, Connecticut, and one of my favorite places that I used to go up into with my brother was the Cabo Mountain Reservoir area. Even back then, it was very steep in legend, and a lot of it is very hard to get into. That morning, it was the last day of hunting season in the state of Massachusetts for shotgun. And I know a lot of people, they say you can't hunt deer with a shotgun. Yeah, you can. Okay, in some states, that's all you can use unless it's primitive firearms. 12-gauge shotgun, 2 3/4-inch slugs. I only carried buckshot if I had to go into Mount Laurel or something like that. I knew which direction pretty much the wind was going to be blowing that day, and I had to go from the Westfield area up towards the Cabo Mountain area, and I had passed by a farm, and so I drove by that farmland, and I don't know, maybe a mile or so down the road, you can either take a right and go into Cabo Mountain, or you can park right there, and then you have to walk in. On the left-hand side of the road, you have to walk down an old fire road that's only accessible for employees that are going to be checking the reservoir or anything like that. And there was a marker there. It's called Indian Rock, and it was a profile of 3 different Indians on the same rock. Little ways past that was the trail I was going to take, and it happened to go up Drake Mountain. As it went up Drake Mountain, it slung off to the left a little bit, so you had to walk in there like maybe a half mile or so, I guess, and sling off to the left, and then it'd go up over the top of the ridge of that mountain, about 3/4 of the way up, right on that bow where it straightened back out to the right and went up over the ridge. There were a set of 3 boulders up there. I used to look at it, and you have those thoughts in your head, well, that looks like, how did these boulders get here? That looks like Stonehenge in a way, But I had found evidence that the deer were actually bedding down in that area too. There's plenty of feed in the area. There's another reason why I chose that area. I had all that marked on a topographical map. So I knew basically where they were going to be that morning, because the wind was actually blowing down the side of Drake Mountain, down over the Granville Reservoir side. So I proceeded in, and as I got, fairly close to that, those boulders where I figured the deer would be bedded down, I could see my breath, and it was a little crispy outside. You can kind of get used to telling the temperature outside, because if you can just instantly see your breath when you puff your breath out, that's pretty cold. That's probably 30 or below, okay? But I jumped the deer. The deer obviously heard me. They never seen me. They didn't smell me, because I listened to them. They jumped up and they took off straight off towards the top of that ridge that paralleled the road that I'm about ready to take, because I figured that blew my chances of getting a deer right there. But my only hope now was to stalk them and then get out in front of them and set up an ambush them, you know. And the way I did that is I would take like what I call a two-step. I don't want to be sounding like a two-legged animal. If it does hear me, I'm going to be as quiet as I can, but if it does hear me, I'm going to go toe heel. Plus you can adjust your weight a lot better that way than walking from your heel to your toe and then taking off on that. That's how you actually crunch up little twigs and things like that. I could hear them just on the other side of that ridge. Couldn't see them, but I could hear them, and they were paralleling the same road that I was on. Hindsight, I could hear something on the other side of them, and I figured it was probably just a buck or something like that. 200, maybe a little over 200 yards to the point where I would have to ambush them. That road traveled straight down towards that path traveled straight down towards that apple orchard, which was probably now about at least a mile from my location. The ambush point that I had planned on actually dog-legged back down around the other side of where they were getting ready to come through, and Drake Brook came out of the mountain right almost at the very top right there. So on that dog-leg there was a stone wall that went directly across from the road that I was on to that dog-leg right on that corner there. That was my ambush point. That's where I was hoping to get to. I got to it. But as I approached it, of course, if you're a hunter, you're going to look around. You don't want any grouse popping up or pheasant, turkey, or even squirrels running around. Some squirrels, I get a lot of red squirrels up around there, and them things will just totally rat you out, give you away, and start chattering and everything else. I didn't see a blessed thing. There wasn't anything there. So I set up my position. I could hear them coming through the top of that ridge there. They're headed towards that stone wall, and they slowed down. I could hear what sounded like scraping, the ground, so I figured that they're probably browsing, So I'm facing that stone wall, crouched down a little bit, and I pick up movement on my 9 o'clock, right just in my peripheral. It sounded like the deer kind of stopping. They were just grazing just a little bit, browsing. I looked over, I still got my shotgun pointed over there because I know whatever it is on the ground. I looked over there. Now people, when I tell you that I figured it's probably a deer silhouette, lengthwise, spread out on there with its head on the other side of that tree. I was brought up to not shoot a deer laying down, sleeping. It was laying there, and I can hear the deer getting a little bit closer. And I look back over there because I have my shotgun, and I halfway between, we'll say, because I don't know if it's going to just pop up and run, then I can get a shot. So I'm flipping back and forth. So now I'm watching over on the other side of that stone wall because this thing is moving. It starts getting up even more, bunching up, I want to say, and it's big bodied. So I'm assuming it's taking my attention again, and I'm back on it. Still trying to maintain concentration on those deer on the other side of that stone wall. And I'm thinking now that it's not a deer, that it's a bear. It's big bodied, still got its head around the other side of the tree, and I definitely don't want to get bum rushed by a bear. Maybe it came out of the tree and it had cubs in somewheres around close by. That would probably promote the bear being angry at me, and at 35 or 38 yards, whatever you want to call it, that's close quarters for me. I've got slugs in that gun, and I buckshot in that gun. The first shot counts, It started getting up a little bit more. And then now I can see that it doesn't look like a bear. It looks like a guy. So now I'm flipping back, I'm going back toward him, flipping back straight towards the deer on the other side of that stone wall, halfway to 3/4 of the way, standing with its head on the other side of the tree, hugging the tree. I'm thinking definitely this is a man. The silhouette is a man. And I've got my shotgun pointed right over that stone wall. And he continues to get up. And now I'm thinking that what I need to do, because his head's on the other side of that stone wall, on the other side of that tree, if those deer come over that stone wall, they're going to come between us. They could come between us, or one could come between us. And that first deer that comes over, believe me, that was going to be the one that I was going to shoot. So I want to be able to be at least in his peripheral vision, so that if he sticks his head around my side of the tree, he's going to have to, if a deer tries to come between us, he's going to spot me. He's going to pick up movement from me. I'm looking at this so-called guy again, and he's absolutely big. He's huge. I'm looking for a marker on the tree. I'm looking for a twig, a branch, something. I don't know how this is all going to go down, if he's going to walk away after all this is said and done. But I mean, this guy was big. I've never really seen a guy. I've seen some big men, and this guy was a little bit beyond that. I found a piece of moss on that tree, and I said, okay, I put it in my memory bank. I said, okay, let's get back to work here, you know. And looking back over that stone wall, and all hell broke loose on the other side of that stone wall. I have no words to describe this to people. It sounded like something came out of the trees. I could hear boulders, not just rocks or stones. I could hear boulders clacking, you know, like being thrown and hitting another boulder. I could hear what sounded like if you went down to a gymnasium and they have a 250-pound hanging bag and you hit it with a baseball bat. You can distinctly tell if they used a baseball bat or if they just used a little a tree branch or something. This was not a branch. This was a limb. This was big. This was definitely making contact with something. There was a knockdown, drag out going on over there. Everything you can imagine was going on. I didn't hear any screaming. I didn't hear any grunts or groans. This being that was at the tree, he stuck his head around my side of the tree, and he was looking directly across over that stone wall, and he caught me in his peripheral. I'm no longer in the crouch position. I'm standing. I'm waiting for them deer one of them to go left, right, up the middle, whatever, you know, hoping anyways. But he caught me in his peripheral, and he looked over, and he looked back over that stone wall again, and he snapped his head at me. He had the look of shock on his face that he couldn't believe that I was standing there, and I'm looking at him, and I mean, I seen the Patty film and stuff, but I've never seen anything like this. I mean, I understand it now. People have the uncanny valley thing going on, and you have fight or flight and all of that, but he snapped his head back at me and looked at me. That was pretty much set for me what I was looking at. I was absolutely looking at like a missing link. That's all I can tell people. Absolutely enormous. Totally wrecked my day in a way. You know, who was I going to tell this to? And there was a lot going on in my mind. That's when he decided that what he was going to do is he was going to broadside me. He's going to face off with me. When he looked at me, he brought his right leg out a little bit further. He's still hanging onto the tree a little bit for balance, I guess, with his left arm. And he brought his left leg around. So he's facing me, and I got my 12 gauge. I got it right on his chest. I don't know what's about to go down here. I don't even know where I'm really going to shoot this. I can only assume that it's so human-like that I'm going to need to put a slug right in its chest. You know, semi-automatic. I probably do one or two. In the same thought I had in the back of my mind is there's more than one. There's definitely more than one there. So he took a step towards me, about a half a step, and he put his hands out, his palms facing me, fingertips facing towards the sky, elbows in, waist level, and spaced evenly apart, just below his chest but above his waist. And he pumped them like 2 times at me, and this is unbelievable. So I'm starting to do my wellness check on myself. You know, am I dreaming? What's going on here? And as you hear the different things that happened, every step he took towards me, or every single thing he did towards me, he looked at me like you would look at a child and see if that child understood you. You'd even be shaking your head yes, or, you know, do you understand? And that was pretty much it. And it was like when the light went off in my eyes, he understood that he could walk closer. And right after he put his hands out to me and did that, I lowered my shotgun. I have heard this only from one other man that had a similar encounter like mine, and he proceeded to walk towards me. What bothered me later on in time, after trying to figure out why me and everything on this encounter, is he knew how to approach me. Well, he proceeded to walk towards me, and as he walked towards me, he took, I call it ancient language evolution. If you look it up, you'll see a lot of pictures like of orangutans and stuff, and they have like their right arm, their fist closed, their finger pointed out. And again, he takes that finger and he points it right to my chest. And then he takes it and points it to his own chest. I take that to mean that we were equal, because he was He didn't point to himself first. We were on even ground, and he was giving me respect, and he would watch me to see what my reaction was. My shotgun is no longer going to be available to me. He's closing that distance, and I'm feeling very comfortable about it. Like this thing's trying to communicate with me. As he gets closer, he's going to give me another hand signal too. He has, I call it, he has no food, and he's looking for food. And the way he does that is the same thing. Elbows into his sides, hands out in front of him, almost like you're going to carry something at about that level, you know, from the waist up just a tiny bit. Does the whole thing, palms down, you know, evenly spaced apart, palms up. I'm thinking, yeah, okay, he has no food, he's looking for food. Now things are coming into perspective for me. Is he hunting the same deer as me? Excuse me. And he was probably set up on a pinch point, an ambush himself. I can see a lot about him. I'm taking it all in. From the 35-yard mark, it looked like his hair was black, very black. I couldn't really tell where that hair started and ended on his face at that range. As he got closer, I could see a lot better that his skin tone, his complexion there matched that hair very, very well. When he got a lot closer, which I'll tell you is, I could tell that it wasn't black, that the hair was actually a dark brown, and the same with the skin. It was more like, for a lack of better description, more like Jamaican, African-American, you know, it was kind of ashy. It seemed like it would change. It had a bit of a sheen to it or whatever. You know, it would be like black, and then depending on that sunlight that was glinting off of him and his hair. He did those hand signals on food, no food. And he got closer, and he gave me another hand signal, again with his right hand, and he pointed over my shoulder left, over my shoulder right, and I took that to mean, like, where did you come from? Considering the fact is, when he was by that tree and he did a double take on me, he was taken aback by, he looked like he was shocked. So I'm thinking, where did I come from? During all of this, I got the idea, because he's getting closer, that he's going to want me to try to communicate with him. The only thing that I have to be able to communicate with him is some of the things that he did. You know, I don't know why I didn't try speaking, but I figured that the reason why he didn't try speaking is because he already knew that I probably don't speak his language. So he's trying something very primitive that Native Americans would do. So I'm also still doing that check on me. I had already checked. I could smell my gun oil. I did a little puff of air out. I wanted to check that wind direction again. It was coming in over my right shoulder. A plane went over my head. I know it was headed towards Bradley International Airport. I checked my wristwatch. I don't know exactly what time. I know it was about 10 or 11 minutes after the hour. That's all I remember on that. He approached even closer, and he stuck his hand out. I used to say like 5 yards, because I had a real tough time with even getting this far in my encounter. He was standing close enough that he could put his hand out between the two of us, and I had to look down, right down. His palm was right smack dab in front of me. I stood below his shoulder, but just above his bicep. Where we have hair on our arms, exactly, he had hair on his arms. Where we don't, they don't. It blends in so well with the skin. The same way with the face, really human looking. His hair is about 5-6 inches long. Of course, he had the brow ridge, blue eyes. And the way I described him to Sibylla was husky blue. Take a look at a husky's eyes that are blue. You know, they're prettier than ice blue. They're magnificent, and that's exactly what he had. And he was checking me out this whole time too. I was checking him out. Some people say, "Well, are you sure that it was a male?" Well, believe me, I wasn't going to check anything else out. He was checking me out. I didn't know anything about them. Definitely didn't want him to get the wrong impression. But at that range, when he stuck his hand out, his palm up, I knew he wanted me to take a look at his hand, and that's pretty close range, and I started getting a little concerned there. So me having a prior history of being a fighter, I started dropping my hand down to my sidearm. And I know that some people say, well, you can't have a side. Yeah, guess what? If I'm going in the woods, I'm having a sidearm, and I'm going to have a knife, I'm going to have survival gear on me. I definitely have that on me, not to hunt with, but for protection, just in case something happens to me. And I started dropping my hand, trying not to move my shoulder, and watching him and dropping my hand down to my sidearm. My palm was just almost getting a purchase. I could just feel my palm touching the grip on my sidearm. It was a 9mm, and he noticed the movement. He looked at me, and he was not happy. And he took his left hand and he tapped his right hand, his palm. He wanted me to look at his palm, so I did. And I was able to look at it and suck it all in, and looked just like our palms. He had clean hands, he had clean fingernails. The ironic thing is that he had no lifeline. You know, when that was fresh in my mind, that was one of the things that I looked up. I wanted to be able to remember everything that I had seen that day. And I looked it up as quickly as I could, because I know that people forget a lot of things, you know. I had no lifeline. And that was pretty much when he gave me another little look, kind of like nod, and I parlayed some of that sign language back to him, like, you know, where did you come from? And I don't have any food. I didn't do the one where, you know, I wanted food. That was pretty much it right there. And when I did that over his shoulders and stuff, that's when he decided that was the end of the situation there. And he looked at me, kind of nodded a little bit, and he looked kind of cornered towards that stone wall a little bit, and he could see over the stone wall. He was well above my head, and he let out 3 whoops, about a second and a half in between. And anybody who even shoots a gun regularly, you learn to count your ammo when you're shooting a gun, you know. And if you're a musician, you learn the beats in your head, how many beats are going on. You might not be aware of it until afterwards. You can go back and play the music in your head. It was about a second and a half in between each whoop. And then he looked back towards me, did the same thing towards me again. And then he looked back over that stone wall and he whistled. And that whistle sounded just like a human being whistling, sounded just like the kind of whistle that we would use in our hunting party when we were trying to locate guys that were on I'd call them drivers. We weren't really driving, but we would spread out. We would have one guy out on point, and if he'd come across some good sign or anything like that, he'd just give a little like that to get somebody's attention, to get them over, because you need another hunter with you, because you got something that's hot on the ground that's, you know you're close by and you want to move in on it. So that's when everybody comes together. That was that kind of whistle. Looked at me, and he gave an arm signal to whoever or whatever was on the other side of the stone wall. It was like, go there or come on. And he pointed back towards the area that he came from. That was his intention. He basically looked at me like saying goodbye. He just bowed that head a little bit, and he went off towards that tree, past that tree. He didn't run. It wasn't jogging. It was just so fluid. It was just say unbelievable. It was just very, very fluid. And he went past that tree, probably get out to about the 55-yard mark, maybe a little bit further than that. He turned back towards me, and that's when I could hear again, like all heck break loose on the other side of that stone wall. But this was a little bit different. That noise did calm down about 3/4 of the way through my encounter with this being, this forest person. It was quiet over there, and this kind of kicked it back up, ramped it up, sort of in a way, because I could hear something coming in through the saplings. And this thing was headed right towards Drake Brook. I knew that it wasn't going to cross a stone wall near me. I knew it was going to cross a little piece of the broken stone wall in the corner there, over the path, and then have to cross over Drake Brook to get to this one's location. And it sounded like a rhinoceros coming through those saplings. So like it was tearing them out. It sounded like it was tearing them out of the ground, snapping them or whatever. And that's when I could pick up movement, right when it crossed that broken part of that stone wall in that path. I could pick up movement, and I picked up some brown, like a cinnamon colored brown, jumped the brook area, and it was headed right towards that big one that came over towards me. And it was literally elbows and heels fast. I've shot deer on the run. I've shot bird, whatever. This was extremely fast. And he got over towards that big one there. And they were kind of kitty cornered towards me, kind of facing each other, but still towards my direction. And they had a little conversation there. It's the best I can tell people. I never heard the Sahara sounds, the Ron Moorhead tapes, but when I did hear them, I can tell you this. That's kind of what it sounded like. And people said, well, why doesn't it sound like exactly like the same? Well, you know what? We're talking about, going and getting a pizza, and somebody else is talking about mowing the lawn. Okay? It doesn't matter what both people are talking about. They're going to sound different. The amount of emotion that's going to be in it, but is it going to sound like the same, basically the same? Yes, that's what I heard. I heard the Sahara sounds. I heard what I would say that you people would recognize as the chatter, or you want to call it samurai chatter. They're having their little conversation there. Big one points directly at me. I hadn't moved an inch. I'm thinking the whole time, I'm saying to myself, man, I don't know where they're going, but I sure would like to learn more. I'd like to follow them, and see where they're going. They go up in a tree. They're going to go in a hole in the ground. They're going to go in a cave and roll a boulder back in front of the cave. Where are you going, But this one pointed at me, and that littler one, which stood a little over the shoulder of the big one, it was cinnamon colored, still, a little bit shorter than the big one. And it kind of put its head down a little bit to look underneath this little branch that was sticking out there, and spotted me, and it looked back at the big one, and it did a double take on me. It couldn't believe I was there. Now, I've had some people, make comments on the podcast. Do you think that maybe what was going on is that the big one was like an alpha set up on that pinch point, and it was chewing out the younger one? Like, how the heck did this guy get there? And the younger one was probably going, well, what are you talking about? I didn't see anybody, and well, tell me what that is over there, because I can tell you I walked over to it. That's a human being with a shotgun. They're a lot smarter than we think they are. Obviously, if they have a language, which is proven with Scott Nelson, they are able to access that 12th nerve in their mouth and everything else. So anyways, it ratted me out. And that's when the big one did that hand signal with his finger, pointed to the chest of that littler one, and basically told him to do a flanking maneuver around me, around to my right, way out and around to my right. And then he pointed to himself. And I don't know if he was doing that for me. He could have just easily had told that one there, or if it was also for me, that he's going to go around me to this side over here. They split up. So now I'm thinking that this is my chance. I'm very, very concerned at this point. Why they really did that, I don't have time to really contemplate it. I need to go over to the tree where it was standing and get a measurement where that piece of moss was. Up until I came out with this, people were always saying, well, they're 15 feet tall, they're 25 feet tall. Really? How you measuring them? You might be surprised that deer looks huge until you get up to it, and then it looks more like a Great Dane. Okay, distance is funky in the woods until you really learn how to get out there and hunt. Everybody thinks that they can do it. Take a rock and throw a rock, practice in your yard, go out there. So I stood next to the tree, and I put my hand on top of my head, and I moved back just a little bit, and then I measured up from my hand using my finger, tip of your finger down to your first knuckle on there. That's 1 inch. And I meticulously went up that tree, 7 foot 8 inches. I figured that this forest person was north of 500 pounds, up here between 500 and 600. Some people say it was probably, considering the shape that it was in, it was probably closer to 600 pounds. Could have even been heavier. When I say it was in shape, I'm saying that this thing was in absolute unbelievable shape. Unbelievable. Could easily run down a deer. Then I tried to look to see where it went through out to that area where the two of them were standing. I could see impressions in the foliage on the ground. There was like an area that would be a vernal pool in the springtime. It was a little bit of a knoll. I'm thinking that this thing was crawled up to that tree. That's why I never seen it to begin with. That it was getting itself set up on that pinch point, on that ambush area, and watching whatever the other ones that were on the other side of a stone wall, directing them or whatever the case may be. But I could see where it was pushed down a little bit. No real impression, but you can see where somebody goes through and just mats down, some foliage or whatever. And I decided, well, what I need to do is I need to correlate the stride with the height so that I can confirm the height. So I tried to take a little jump, a tiny jump, stand still to the track. I didn't make it. So I moved back just a hair and jumped. I didn't make it. So I moved back like 2 paces or so, very, very short distance, and did like a little run, tiny, kind of like a really quick step run, and tried to jump into it. And I still missed it. So I would have to say I'm 6'3", and yeah, my stride is roughly the average human there at roughly my height is 3 feet stride. And this was an absolute normal, was not a running stride. So that probably would have put that at around 8 feet, 7'8" to 8 feet tall. That's what I came up with. After that, I decided that I'm going to leave the area. I got home and I just didn't know who to tell. I just started doing drawings like I was on Encounters of the Third Kind, caught myself in the middle of it, just tearing them up and crumpling them and throwing them in the trash. I said, because I didn't want to forget any detail. I knew that there was going to come a day that quite possibly somebody was going to need to hear this. It's nothing but a story until you start pulling it apart and looking at it. These things are seriously very intelligent. And that's my message to everybody, to give that to them, because people out there want to say, well, we need a DB. You're right. We do, because we're incapable of doing research properly. We didn't learn it in school. We need all the research, right down to what were you wearing? Did you have any cologne on? Everything. What was going on that day? Temperatures, all of that. You need all of that. Okay. Otherwise, that's exactly what they're going to do. I'm finding that there's an average of 3 to 4 in a family unit. So let's take a look at that scientific evidence again with a DB. They need 2 of them. There goes. You're killing something. You hear people that are hunters come right out and say, I couldn't make the shot. I couldn't shoot because it looked too human-like. It looked like, if you look up Solo Man, kind of like Solo Man, like the missing link.
And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment below terrifying discovery. So that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. And as always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.